I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're broadcasting today, Turrbal and Yagara people. It's a real privilege to be the head of learning here and work with my colleagues, particularly this morning, Debbie Britton, Emily Ewan Hunt, and Rebecca Smith, who've, we'd love to be working with you on site and meeting with you all here, but so glad that you're joining us from, across the state, and also many of you also from interstate as well, joining us for this morning. Okay. So Artists Exchange is a program that developed really through a lot of consultation. The first conversation started before, really in the early conversations of when the new visual art syllabus was being written. So we spoke broadly across a number of agencies who work in art education across the state, but we also went into 19 different regional councils across Queensland and sat down with art educators, whether they're in the classroom, in galleries, or artists who work a lot with schools and communities. And so the idea of Artists Exchange started really through a very broad, very wide-ranging and deep process of consultation. And that really set us up to develop something that we knew from the outset was really going to address needs and produce some really meaningful outcomes and experiences. So the program started with us going to the Bunya Mountains. So the idea of Artists Exchange became a 3-day program. And in that 3-day program, we invite artists, art teachers, and artist educators from galleries to sites of cultural significance. And we were fortunate to start that process at the Bunya Mountains. And you see a shot there of the very first, the start of the Artists Exchange program with the Murray Ranges up in the Bunya Mountains, welcoming us onto their country through a smoking ceremony. And that's how all of the Artists Exchange programs begin. So they all start with an acknowledgement and a welcome, if possible. And so right from the outset, the program really starts well before we arrive on country. So we've now done an Artists Exchange program at the Bunya Mountains, at Gari, also known as Fraser Island, and at the Carnarvon Ranges. And from those workshops, we've developed online resources, which we'll talk to shortly. I think next slide will help with that. And we intend to, as a gallery, continue doing this across the state. So as we go out to different sites of cultural significance in the state of Queensland, we'll be producing resources and bringing you ideas for workshops so that you can engage your students with the histories and contemporary practices coming out of key sites in regional Queensland, as informed by some of the amazing artists who we get to work with. Next slide, please. So today we're really going to shine the spotlight on our most recent Artists Exchange program, which occurred in the Carnarvon Ranges. And we worked very closely with artist Dale Harding, who's joining us today, in the long-term lead up to delivering this program. And he, in turn, worked very closely with Uncle Milton Lawson, who you see there pictured, welcoming us to the site where we were running the program. So as you can tell by the images you're going to see through this presentation, it's quite profound what takes place in Artists Exchange programs. And that's because of the amount of work and consultation that takes place before we get to a site. And in a lot of ways, it's not dissimilar, intentionally so, to the work that a lot of senior secondary art teachers do in preparing for their authentic arts learning experiences. Because as I say, we started developing this model in the early iteration of writing the curriculum, and people involved in writing the curriculum informed us about the authentic arts learning experiences. So we really wanted to make sure that we were doing our bit as a state gallery to enable communities, particularly in regional Queensland, to have a look at ways that authentic arts learning experiences can happen in rural and remote communities. So the Carnarvon Ranges resource is up. So the idea is once we go and run the workshop, we head out there with our photographers and we document what we do on country and then bring that to you and your students as a resource that you can tap into. And the resources are split up into information about history. If possible, we'll share insight into the ancient history of the site, but we'll also explore more recent histories and particularly histories that have had an impact on the landscape. And environment, similarly then we flow on to think about the current status of the environment, what makes the environment unique, and there's lots of cues in there for art students to really tap into geology and science and be inspired to make work in relation to key sites in Queensland. Strong connections to our collection, and then also an example of how you would engage your students in a workshop about the site as well. So that's a bit of a background as to what Artist Exchange is and the work we're doing in that space. But as I said earlier, we were fortunate really to work closely with artist Dale Harding in the lead up to running the program. He was able to guide us through a range of consultation processes and protocols. And as a result, we were able to, bring together an amazing group of people and really learn firsthand from Dale, his Uncle Milton, and also Uncle Steve Kemp, who were very generous in sharing their knowledge of country with us. And now we're generously being supported by Dale in continuing to share that knowledge as part of Artist Exchange. So it's been a real privilege to work with Dale, and it's doubly my privilege to introduce you to Dale Harding now. Thank you, Dale.
Good morning.
So this morning we want to keep it relatively informal and just have a discussion, Dale, but wanted to first hand over to you, Dale, to give us a sense of your understanding of how significant the country is out there and what it means to you to be working with us here on site at
Okay. Excuse me. Thanks, Terry. And may I acknowledge the learnings team here, Terry and the whole team, for the work that they do. I'm really privileged and fortunate to be part of the conversation, and it's wonderful to see things building and progressing in a way that actually I'm proud to share back with my community. I shared the link to the learning site recently, and I got really great responses from community members in Warrabinda as the first start. So the fact that I'm proud to share it onwards is and maybe a marker of my respect for the program and what they all do here. Also, just out the front here is the Brisbane River, and I'm on Kurilpa Point right now. So Turrbal and Yagara and Jagarapul countries at the core of my respect and acknowledgement when I'm here in Brisbane, particularly if I'm talking about places that aren't here. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging this country, acknowledging the big waterway that's at the front there, and also the elders and their communities of this place, their ancestors and their stories ongoing. And maybe as a small mindfulness towards anyone who's tuning in, and I saw some other locations and places that I'm familiar with in the chat feed come through, it's good for me to often identify where the water is around me, because that's one of the ways that we have interconnectedness. So if everyone can consider where the waterways are in relation to them right now, that also points towards some of the work I've been doing, but also how we all relate back into some of the bigger stories and acknowledge the countries and the waterways and the peoples of where they're at. And so really that's what the Carnarvon Ranges are. They are the headwaters and the site of 5 major river systems that run outwards from there. And so the ancestral communities, the traditional owners, and the communities living now around the Carnarvon Ranges are aware that those major river systems that run away from the Carnarvons flow into many other people's stories, flow into many other territories, language groups, environments, ecosystems. So the water up there is the core of the story, the central point of that story. And my family and some of our other elders talk about that being the center of a wagon wheel that then flows outwards from there. So this here is an image I took on Tuesday this week, actually, and that's looking over the gorge from the highest platform up there on the top, which is colloquially referred to as the roof of Queensland. So the Gurrungbal and the Bidjara people have very strong ties and strong responsibility there in the gorge network. But there's also other communities who are very much part of that story, who are absolutely acknowledged and respected in that story. And they involve Iman and Gungari and Gungabulla and Ngurdi and Karakara, and even the Brown River people as another connected group. And in that, I'd also like to acknowledge that during the artist exchange process up in the Carnarvon regions, we also had Auntie Vanessa from Injune, a Gungari woman, and also Auntie Vicky, a Gungari woman as well, who were present. So their stories are interconnected here via water and via the other relationships that still continue there in the region. And also Auntie Vanessa, who came over from Warrabinda as well. Auntie Roxy as a participant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just jumping in on a couple of things there, that story of water is something that definitely, pardon the pun, courses through artist exchange and has really come to the fore because like you're saying in terms of the river systems that are starting in Carnarvon, when we started the program at the Bunya Mountains, of course, there's river systems that start there as well. Right. And then working with Fiona Foley in Gari and seeing how the rivers spill out into, Gari and the Great Sandy Strait. Those water connections coming from QAGOMA and where we're located really does resonate through artist exchange. And really it's part of artist exchange is the hope that we can bring this knowledge to students and help them understand where river systems start and why those places are so significant environmentally as well as culturally. And you can see here that if this photo was taken last week, things are looking very green and lush out there at the moment. So it speaks a lot to these images, how amazing the place is. Can you give us a sense, Dale, of a bit more with this image of where you're standing and the sort of natural environment, particularly when you're on that plateau?
Sure. Rightio. And I did see another name came through, one of the Flexi Learners teachers there. So I know that there are people among the group who are familiar with the story.
Yeah.
So sitting up on the top here is that's essentially a basalt top ridge. So the soil there is really beautiful, deep reddy brown, and it's volcanic basalt, is my understanding. And there's this kind of aerated volcanic rock that's there as well among that. So the soil's really beautifully fertile. And then moving down through from that platform, kind of here in the treetop you're seeing below, that's an area that national parks have identified. They call that as the ranch. So that essentially is the top of the cliffs that you see if you're inside the gorge. So there's multiple platforms there that you're looking at. So I'm looking from the top down there onto the top of the ranch, and that's under national park, a sandstone, I'd say sandy kind of soils there. And that's where the sandstone cliffs start to kick in. So the water erosion and the falling away of the sandstone has formed those ripples and actually the gorge itself, which runs off on your screen to the right, to the east. So that'd be me standing there looking fairly due north at about midday, I reckon. And then off to the right is the east, which way the Carnarvon Creek runs into the Brown River and then so on into the Dawson and others.
Amazing. And then you've kindly taken another shot. I guess it seems like you're pivoting
Right.
On the same spot or close to.
Right.
Yeah.
So, pardon me, but that top platform is fairly narrow. And so that's less than, I'd say, that's a Kathy Freeman sprint, 100 meter sprint across the top there, from the first photo to this one. And this is looking, I'd say, probably close towards Mitchell, which would be those other Auntie Vicky and Auntie Vanessa now. There's Mitchell's probably just to the right of those, that tree branch there. So that's looking south, slightly west. Yeah.
And I'm really grateful that you've taken these shots and shared them with us, because I think it's the idea of the Artist Exchange program as itself is that we're bringing people together from surrounding towns into these locations, and in so doing, demonstrating that they are kind of connected, even though they might be focused in on working and reporting within sort of local council structures or within their high school. But they're actually right on the doorstep of amazingly significant sites, and that is something that can bind them together. And people have been really receptive to that as artists and art teachers as well. So the whole thing about sometimes the thing we need is staring us right in the face. And when you have a site like Carnarvon Gorge, why would you not go there and connect with people there in a meaningful way when you have the occasion and the opportunity, particularly to work with yourself, Dale, and community on site. So we'll keep pushing on, and I think, but really good to start with that understanding that we're talking about place, and oftentimes as an education team we create education resources about exhibitions or about artists, but this has been a real delight for us as an education team, because we're really looking deeply into place, and to have the time and permission to do that, I think has been really beneficial for us. And that's kind of why we're bringing this to you as a teaching community. I'm just seeing a question coming through. I'm interested in knowing, this is for you, Dale, I'm interested in knowing how you respond to this place in your art practice. And that's a nice segue, I guess, because moving on from talking about place, we do want to talk about practice. And I think practice sometimes is a term that's kind of thrown around, almost like, innovation is kind of thrown around, but really what is practice, particularly practice that's granted by a deep understanding of place? Could you give us some insight on that, Dale?
Sure. An easy way to do that would be to come back to the commission that the Queensland Art Gallery invited me to execute for the rehang of the Australian Art Collection in 2017. So there's some images to come, but that's of, in terms of responding to that location and to place in the art practice, that whole wall painting was really a way of mapping out and illustrating some of the major river systems that run and flow away from the gorge. Mostly they were coming from the eastern side of the ranges. I didn't really go into so much the western and maybe the northern aspects of that, but how do I engage with, respond to that place in my art practice? One of the key motivations that my family and I have is to tell the story in ways which aim to grow the love and the reverence, actually, for the ongoing cultures, for the cultural landscapes that are there, for the ecosystems, and maybe for our collective responsibility to hold them in a place of great care and even defend them if we need to. So part of that defense sometimes in protection might be to consider our impacts there and consider our presence there even. But how do I respond to that? Drawing upon my cultural inheritance from both Nana and Grandad, and considering ways that they might be relevant in my life now. So that's how we ended up making the Reckitt's Blue wall painting and the carving into the plasterboard for the 2017 commission. So yeah, does that go there?
Yeah, yes, Dale. And I think, there's practice in terms of, and you take us through this in the workshop that we'll play later, but I've heard people talk about practice a lot, And, you know, as you would expect in an art gallery, the idea of artist practice comes up quite a lot. Um, and sometimes it's quite academic, or it doesn't necessarily talk to process as much. But with yours, I wonder if we can talk a bit about, you know, how, as a way maybe of introducing what we talk to a bit later in the workshop, about how that even comes down to materials. You know,
Right.
selection of material is part of the practice.
Right. Yeah. And practice being something that I hope is consolidated, and I hope that comes from a cultural foundation,
Mm.
and being a lived and consolidated cultural practice that way, and then drawing hopefully the art practice, which I love. I love being academic. I love being an art history nerd. I love getting into theory and this kind of stuff around it.
Yep.
Nerds, art history nerds rock as well. So I do enjoy that, but for me, they have to come from a translation of an ongoing cultural practice. Is what I really try to hold myself to. So in terms of the practice and also material selection, here I used a practice which has been going on for many millennia, which is choosing a pigment, choosing an appropriate binder, applying them with some form of insight and maybe some skill, hopefully, to create a paint. So Reckitt's Blue was an ultramarine powdered blue pigment. And in this particular painting, I used a water clear binder, acrylic binder. So that was a dry pigment and a binder, combine them together, create the paint that I want to tell the story. So that is a Brisbane, sort of Queensland Art Gallery translation of a cultural practice, which is part of my inheritance, but which is shared globally. You know, it's part of, goes through what we know as international and Western art histories in terms of oil paint making and watercolors, these kind of things. But it's predated across the planet by a really long time by choosing those pigments and binders appropriately to tell the story.
And so Dale, part of the focus of today's session is really that idea of authentic arts learning experiences as it's being taught currently in schools, thanks to really meaningful changes that have happened in the writing of the syllabus.
Right.
What does authentic, I guess, mean to you as an artist who does take authenticity and the level of research and consideration you put into even, as you say, the materials you work with, in not just going to a shop and buying a material, but actually considering how and why you would make a material and work with it? What does that mean in terms of authenticity to you?
Yeah, and it's always good. Like I can catch that word authenticity. We
Yeah.
can catch that in ways which has been unhelpful for Indigenous selves and recognition of ongoing cultural practices, Indigenous practices. We can catch that, but we're really talking about authenticity and maybe who we are now and who I am specifically and who you might be on the other side of a screen today. So as part of thinking about authentic learning or authentic practice, I ask questions around what is already there, what's already here with me, what's already around, what's immediately in my local environment. I look to the environment around me to ask questions around what do I already know, what maybe am I overlooking, what's currently with me, what can we draw upon as part of my personal lived experience. And in that, I was taught by actually two of my professors at art college, one being Jennifer Hurd, an Indigenous professor and an art practitioner herself, and another being Deborah Porch, who was a professor in art history and a practicing artist herself. And those two professors made me really aware that they were operating within the limitations of their own experience. So they knew and respected each other's place in my education in honours year, because they were working to their own strengths, but also aware of the limitations there. So that taught me an incredible lesson, is to what are the limitations of my experience, try to be aware of them and try to stay in that niche or in that pocket so that I'm operating from a place that's good for me, but also safe culturally, socially, politically, these kinds of ones. So in looking to the environment around me and being authentic, I try to ask that question about what is the limitations of my experience. But also in that, then I can start to ask, what do I bring to this environment? So what do I bring to this environment culturally, socially, intellectually? And certainly, what do I bring to this environment emotionally? And in the past, I have done this in really overt ways. And now I'm interested in trying to find ways of blending them all so that I can ask, what do I bring to this environment politically? Maybe as a bit of a conjunction or a consolidation of all of those factors together. What do I bring to this environment around me?
Yeah, and that's an amazing summary there. Just that, even that last statement about you know, or question, what do I bring to this environment, immediately surrounds me. And the idea of working within your limitations and knowing those, I think, you know, it's something that can definitely resonate with art educators, is that idea of the benefits of having constraints, and knowing that you can make your work that's based around what you know, rather than trying to, you know, become an expert in everything. You know, be grounded and you know, when you do have constraints to work in, then sometimes that makes your work better and more meaningful.
Right.
But yeah, that idea of just being able to respond to the environment you're in and understanding what your limitations are within that. It sounds so simple in a way, but if you do, I feel though, as if you do have a philosophy and it's considered, and you've got that mapped out before you start to make, and that makes the process of making a lot easier, I would imagine.
Right.
And by the sounds of it as well, you're constantly reviewing that place and that philosophy. You're bringing things through. It's yeah, and it's not you know, stagnant in that sense, as you just say. At the moment, you're considering more some of the political factors as to why and how you're making work. Is that all fair to say?
Certainly. Yeah. And yeah, I can't add anything more to that, Terry, but I agree totally.
Yeah, in a way, I'm just paraphrasing, but maybe putting a bit of teacher speak on it in a way. But yeah, great to hear how, you know, those mentors have influenced you as well. And I think you know, it's such a strong thing about contemporary art in Queensland, and particularly with contemporary Indigenous artists coming out of Griffith, that there is that kind of community of support. That's
right.
something that I've really come to admire working at the gallery and getting to know artists like yourself. So thanks for sharing that insight with us. And I think if I can use that as a kind of a bridge to the next slide, we could flick that one over. That there's kind of a reference in here. It's compositional as well, Dale, but also I think that if you could talk to your reasoning behind the idea of the form that you've referenced there in the Ricketts blue. Potentially it goes to show, you know, how considered you are in terms of the influences that have shaped your work and you as an artist and as a person. And also I think there's something about this that's talking about you know, presence and absence too.
Right. Yeah. And maybe I could just quickly acknowledge Kim Peyton Smith comment, your engagement with the environment is your authenticity.
That's a great summary, yeah.
Thank you. And looking at composition and absence and presence, this kind of thing, there, you know, absence and presence is swinging back into some of the art world language, and as a bit of a device or you know, there's lots of work being done, physical, you know, making, but also theory and conversation around dialogue. That's the one, discourse around absence and presence. So in the top left of the corner above the doorway that looks down through into the other collection, there's a series of line drawings of what in a way is a figure, a bit of a torso and a head and neck. That for me was always a remembrance or a marker, a way of tracing and remembering matrilineal inheritance a way of maybe acknowledging and calling upon grandmothers and the generational lineages which have enabled me to have some of these understandings and in my cultural inheritance. So compositionally, that was at the end of the long gallery, which runs, you know, are there 5 spaces there, Terry, that run along? There might be 4 or 5 or so.
Oh, yeah.
Looking back down through that corridor, I was interested in bringing some reverence or some kind of elevation to that element of my my intention. So giving them status, elevating them above the doorway, and putting them in a way which has a long distance view and a way of framing the conversation. Say you're walking down that corridor in the past, the work's no longer present, but walking down that corridor, there was an engagement for me with that sort of figure, that ancestral grandmother figure there, before I even entered into the space where the full work was visible. So compositionally, choosing status and elevation and these kinds of things in the space, in the way of making a work live onto the walls, you know, compositional modes is definitely still present, but they come back to the physical experience and they come back to the environment around you again. So thinking of the gallery space as something like a lived landscape. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was a really key work to the reimagining. Well, not so much reimagining, but we as a gallery had the great opportunity to adapt and to think about how we wanted to tell the Australian art story, and landscape was a key thread through there. So in a way, this work, which was a commission and a temporary work,
Right.
was going to introduce that narrative of landscape and reference, you know, the first landscape painters in Queensland through your work, which, you know, it's kind of a shame that it was a temporary work, but you know, that's maybe a separate conversation because it was so loved and you know, but to make a work in that understanding is maybe something we could talk to another time. But to do that at such a time, in terms of how we were telling, you know, a better way of telling, you know, the Australian art story, you know, was such a privilege for the gallery to work with you in achieving that. But I think, you know, the fact that it's a work that's come and it's gone and it's communicated what it needs to communicate.
Right.
I think it also talks to a bit about, again, your practice and how this work has kind of shaped, you know, the fact that it's come and gone, you know, what you're working on now and lessons you've taken out of that process, whether it's in relation to materials, processes, composition.
Right.
If you could talk to a bit about and you know, maybe moving more towards the workshop that we've worked on here. You know, you're seeing the blue from Ricketts Blue here, and the binder was kind of a store-bought binder that you were working with. So how then, I guess, have you taken that idea of, you know, continuing to make pigment forward since this work?
Yeah. Since that work, well, in that work, kind of, there's elements among the real cluster of the shovel handles there. You can see maybe some black hand-drawn marks. Well, they were using Grevillea robusta gum, which is silky oak tree sap, and charcoal. And so there was a process here on this country of considering the use of Grevillea robusta and charcoal to make those marks onto the wall. But again, that's a really beautiful gum, which actually is very gluey, very sticky, very gluey Grevillea robusta gum. And so that in 2017 has led to more and more work. And again, drawing upon and blending between what we know as, what do we call that, like established conventions in maybe composition or material choices, these kind of ones, and drawing upon cultural inheritances and where they overlap and blend and play. And that's where I've been drawing a lot of excitement lately. So Grevillea robusta gum, historically gum arabic, is a watercolor binder, and probably it would get used in sort of Chine Calais, this kind of stuff possibly. But certainly gum arabic is an acacia tree sap, which is water soluble. And so then as a binder for dry pigment or earth pigment or other pigments that are accessible, mixing that through as a binder instead of a store-bought acrylic has become really prominent in what I've been doing. So there's a series of works in different locations that I've made using the gum arabic and dry pigment, and that's been superb. Many reasons, and it kind of gets outlaid in the video in the workshop. But playing with, again, yeah, those overlaps and the intersections of where things meet.
Yeah, so we might take and again, you've kindly taken a quick snap for us of some of the sap that you've sourced yourself from a white cypress gum. Yeah, so this is, you've sourced this in Carnarvon?
In the ranges there, in the region, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
That certainly wasn't inside the gorge network, but it's in the range, in the region. And white cypress is an endemic tree up there, as well as black cypress, and that's some of the recent gum. And it's it was a quick illustration that I had to indicate some of the resources that are in the environment around us. I haven't yet used that as a binder, but certainly the gum, the sap from the white cypress, it smells beautiful, and when you light it up and you burn it, it has this incredibly gorgeous aromatic smell. I understand that it's medicinal, these kind of purposes, but that comes back to looking what's around. So down here in southeast Queensland, the Grevillea robusta is an endemic species. Certainly it's would be locked into and a major component of the cultural landscape that's here, which I can't speak for, but in central Queensland, the white cypress then is really prominent as well as many other species. So what's in the environment immediately around me, not so much gum arabic or Grevillea robusta, but certainly white cypress, the angophoras, bloodwoods, these kinds of things are up in those regions as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so the idea that we're not literally potentially only drawing inspiration from the beauty of an environment, but working with material that's found in the environment. There's so much poetry and conceptual opportunity in that, in and of itself. And that's kind of a mind-blowing part of what we're going to share with you today. Those of you who are joining us, and if you've joined us a bit late, thanks for coming along. We pre-recorded a workshop component because obviously we can't do this on site yesterday, and Dale takes us through a number of ways that you can actually again, as we're talking about authenticity, respond to the environment that's around you, and that might include house and home or your school environment, to achieve something similar to what Dale's discussing here. So,
if I may, Terry,
yeah,
just to come back to that one this is looking at a really solid platform from a cultural perspective of mine around environmental contact, and there are for me protocols and other considerations which I take into account in that process. So part of what I do if I'm drawing on a plant or an animal material is I'm really asking the questions and drawing upon what I might already have as a protocol or a consideration in there. And then if I swing back to where Terry's going, is that the domestic environment has all sorts of other materials which are more readily available and open to greater interaction.
Yeah. So we'll be able to go into more of what that means exactly in the video, and it's such an amazing. As we're recording, my brain was just frankly exploding, Dale, because art teachers were always trying to find new ways to make work and really cost-effective ways at times to make work, and it's definitely the case, and what we'll see later is that you can achieve quite a lot by responding to just what's around you with some of these techniques that they'll share with us later. So we're going to jump over now and introduce you to, it's my pleasure to introduce you to a very experienced and teacher and colleague in a way, Andrew Peachey, who teaches down at Redlands as the Dean of Arts. Andrew's been part of a group that works with us here at the gallery called the Teachers Advisory Group. And he's kindly accepted or responded to the request. Andrew, when we were thinking about this program and how to give teachers an opportunity to see not only how Dale responds to his country, but also an example of a teacher who has for some time now been engaging their students with culturally significant and environmentally significant sites. Andrew came to mind and he's kindly accepted to share with us how you do that with your students, Andrew. So I'm going to hand over to you now to take us through your authentic experiences that you run with students in Quandamooka and the surrounds.
Thanks so much, Terry. Thanks, Terry. Thanks so much. Terry did mention this morning too, looks like I'm in a guitar shop, but welcome everybody. Thanks so much for the opportunity to speak with you. I'm in one of the music rooms at school because it's a bit more soundproof. I'd also like to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging on the land that I am on, which is Quandamooka land. We're down here at Wellington Point and southeast Queensland on the bay. Yes, our authentic experience that we took our year 12s last year. So in fact, I was still in year 11. So it started we had this in term 4 last year. So we have a bit of a shift in when we start year 12. We started the year before, start unit 1. And we had 3 staff come across to Stradbroke Island, Minjarrabah. And that was Jenny Burgess, the other art teacher here. And we also have an artist and teacher aide, Dave Scott. So he came over as well. So Dave's a ceramicist, Jenny's a printmaker, and I'm a painter. And we purposely have made it 3 days, a 3-day trip that we take. So if we want to head over onto the next slide there, thanks. So we had 13 students experience this, and it's really, the whole idea was for an authentic experience to be immersed over time. So we have been fortunate that we've had our school has allowed us to be able to go for 2 days of school and 1 day on a weekend, and we camped at a rock campsite. So this is actually at a rock, and that's at a rock there that you can see, and at a rock beach, and that's our students. And we also had Renata Buziak, artist Renata Buziak, come and stay with us also. And this particular photograph was when Renata took them for a silent walk, a silent walk one morning. So up early, and they weren't allowed to speak, and just to be able to be immersed in the environment. And at times they would stop and just sit and listen and look. It was just wonderful, peaceful. With our crazy speed of life and school and everything, it was wonderful to be able to spend time to just slow everything down. It was wonderful. So they also spent time out here doing drawings, and we also did ceramics out here, doing other activities. All right, you can go to the next slide, thanks. So our experience actually began a couple of weeks beforehand, and we also, in our planning, we had the voice of Janelle Williams. So Janelle, of course, for years was State Panel Chair for Visual Art. the voice of Janelle about immersing kids into an experience over a longer period of time, and particularly with her trips that she would take from Cairns out to Chillago. So, excuse me. So it also was a couple of weeks beforehand as well that we engaged our school librarian, and I've got a bit of a connection there because the librarian's my wife, and she's also interested in local history. So she was able to come and provide resources and also connections for some of our local museums. So there's the Cleveland Museum, we've got Wynnum Manley Historical Society, and we've also got, you know, and you'll see we spent some time in the Dunwich Museum as well. So she came and spoke, and these particular shots are in fact of Wynnum. And so, you know, to be able to go to these exact same positions and see how the place has changed. We can go to the next slide, thanks. We also engaged with access to some of the images from GOMA. So engage with them online. So Megan Cope, of course, is a Quandamooka artist. And she had this work, Fluid Terrain, which she, of course, renames, takes back the names of all of the Indigenous names of all of the land and geographic sites. So this is quite significant for our students. So we've had, as I say, talking about local history, and then to flip it right back even prior to over 150 years ago to what are the actual names, the Indigenous names of the areas that we inhabit. And also for us to look at this and go, well, where are we on this map? And for us to have the beginning of a paradigm shift for our students' thinking. You could go to the next slide, thanks. We also, through the GOMA site, were able to have a look at, you know, Sonia Carmichael's weaving, and of course, so that get them into their thinking that we're going to be engaging in some weaving while we're over on Stradbroke, and also through the textbook, have a look at the work of Lacey Carmichael. And you may know, but I was on the team that did the writing for that book, and so I had quite a few conversations with Lacey, which was awesome, and to be able to speak with her about how they had to go over to the UK to go to museums to find weaving that was Quandamooka and to relearn how that weaving was done, and then for her to, when she studied fashion design, to bring that weaving into garments. But also with their weaving, they'll walk the beach and find debris like old fishing nets, etc., and they will also weave those into the traditional materials that they use. So here's this sort of cross between modern materials and traditional materials being interwoven into each other. So if you can go to the next slide, thanks, that'd be great. So just prior to going over to Stradbroke, the students had to make a ticket. And again, this is Janelle Williams' idea that she would have with her students to before they got onto the train. And we love the idea. It gets them engaged also physically, making into some, how do they envisage the landscape that we're on now, and envisage, in fact, even say colonization. So you've got a very old photograph that one of the students had found, and then they had monoprinted over the top where the jetty, etc., is of down here at Wellington Point. So they had to hand us that ticket before they could get onto the ferry. Whilst they were on the ferry, they also had to be engaged in drawing into their journal. So anything that they could take out of that ferry journey, so drawing whether it's the water of the islands or even things that are on the actual ferry. We go to the next slide, thanks. So once we're on Minjarrabah, we connected with Matt Burns. So Jenny Burgess had booked this with Matt, and Matt is just fantastic. He's excellent with reconnecting with and getting all our thinking in relation to traditional methods, hunting, gathering, where particularly at Dunwich, there were sacred sites, and he took us for quite a walk around the area, and realizing too that a lot of the land that we were walking on was a midden. So he took us down to the beach, and he said you can see actually into the side of the beach, you know, up as it goes up onto where the grass is, you can see and I don't have a photo of it here, but you can see where the all the shells are embedded into the bank. So that's also when you think about then how much consumption of, you know, shellfish, etc., had been done over hundreds, thousands of years, you know, and they've all been placed on there. And, you know, we just see it as a nice green grassy area to walk on. The history that's evident there. So he also took us down to the beach, and we showed us how to make some ochre. So that's also on the next slide, thanks. So he did a demonstration, I had a video of that, but the kids all had a go of finding that rock and then using the water and rubbing it up against itself, rubbing it on the rock there. Again, giving potential ideas on, you know, on how students could make. They also had to take some of that and keep a record of that in their journals. We can go to the next slide, thanks. And the Quandamooka have they have the right to kill one of the dugongs, one dugong per year. And that had been relatively freshly killed, and the meat of that dugong is distributed amongst people on Stradbroke. And as much as, you know, we consume meat and vegetables, fruit, etc. every day, for some of our students, seeing this dugong skeleton was confronting, because they had never experienced anything like this. You know, we see this, we see our food packaged neatly in refrigerators, freezers, etc. at Woolworths and Coles and IGA, etc. And here, seeing the remains of this dugong just off the beach, you know, so you could almost see the full form of it. Yeah, like I say, it was very confronting. And some of the students, in fact, used even this part of our 3 days as their stimulus. Matt also showed us how they made spears, boomerangs, etc., etc. The kids also had a go at, you know, throwing boomerangs, etc. So, and also being able to, of course, ask Matt some very significant questions. So it was also interesting. I haven't got this actually in my notes, but the names of the houses of our school are the 4 first Europeans that landed on Stradbroke Island, and Matt was asked, what's your understanding of those 4 men, because they were, you know, convicts with ticket of leave, etc. And it is totally different from how we perceive those 4 European men. Totally different. All right, if we can go to the next slide, thanks. So we also, in this, not long after the Matt talk, we went and spent a fair bit of time at the Dunwich Museum, which is it's a really fantastic space. And you can see they're sitting in little kids' chairs there, but was an opportunity for them also to engage with artifacts, objects, stories that are in there. All right, if we can keep going, thanks. Next slide. Yep. We spent a little bit of time setting up camp at Rock. So we'd already done these talks, etc., before we'd set up camp. Okay, we go to the next slide, please. And we had Delvine Cockatoo Collins come and spend time with us. And so we had reeds that we initially were weaving with. And then we went on our bus up to Point Lookout, and Delvine cut down some of the cotton tree branches. And she told us which ones were best to choose. There were people, of course, at the cafes looking across the road at us, cutting down these branches. You know, it's quite funny. Anyway, but you know, they couldn't be too old, they couldn't be too young. They just, you know, had to be just right sort of thickness branches. So we cut them down, and of course, you know, we're thinking, how do you get material from a branch? You know, we get it back down to the campsite, and they peel off the bark. She shows how to peel off the bark, and you get the white material just underneath the bark, and then we strip that back, so it had these long strands of white material that were just under the surface, and then it had to be washed, and the amount of sap that came out of that material was incredible. They just had to keep washing and washing and washing and washing until it got to a point where it became this beautiful long strands of string. So if we can go to the next slide, here's a video on the left-hand side of Delvine weaving, and on the right-hand side is one of our students weaving. And in fact, the one on the right that's weaving, you'll see her work later on, but in response to this. So the classic is with the student, you know, she's saying in here, just see me fail. You're going to see me fail this, you know, and also, but just having a go and continuing to having a go. And she, you know, did incredibly well with it. And to see, but also from Delvine, the proficiency of doing this. And it was also great that we were all sitting around talking whilst their hands are busy. So here's talking was, you know, part of the talking was, of course, I can't really do this. How can I, you know, can you give me some help? And other talking, of course, once they become more automatic, it's talking about, you know, other things that are happening in the day, or, you know, talking about life. Just seeing a couple of questions there. So from Kim, so how's the experience funded? We budget for it. So it's in our budget. We budget quite a fair bit for this trip. And also from Kelda, that's fantastic that you've had that, also that experience. So that's wonderful. All right, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Now, there are a whole stack of other activities that we did in the space, and some of them were right into the night time, of course, early mornings, and we also went to other places such as the gorge, where there was lots of rubbish. It seems to be a spot where you know, the weather seems to attract all of the debris from the ocean seems to come into the gorge. So we spent a little bit of time collecting all this microscopic plastic that had been washed up in there, and other bits of rubbish and plastic. And again, one of those students from that has done something to do with a couple of students, in fact, have done things to do with the environment and the plastics that are in the environment. So the very final thing before we got back onto the barge was we went to the cemetery, and this was a very emotive time, in fact, and I would say for all the students. Now, there was nobody giving us a guide. We just went in there. It's the second oldest cemetery in Queensland. You can see there, for example, that shaped cross. There's nothing written on those crosses. They're made of metal. I also, many years ago, did a residency with QCA on Peel Island, and where the leprosy colony was. And I spent some time in the grave site there, and the graves are very similar shape to these, with no names. They're all numbers. So you have to actually go to a registry office to find those names with those. But the thing I think that was quite powerful for our students, because of the history side of this, the erasure of, because a lot of grave sites are so old, the erasure of names that are on there, like who are these people? It's like this, in many ways, there's like lost histories that are there, and that's sort of also fed into Matt Burns' talk of lost histories. And so it gave from even a European perspective on lost histories, and then how that also what that means for Indigenous cultures of lost histories, and for the Carmichaels having to go even to the UK to museums to find, the weaving, to how do we redo this? How can we do this? Remake these traditions that we had. Anyway, there were quite direct responses from all of our activities that we did back to everything that we had done on Stradbroke. And now I know that funding is difficult, and I realise that, and I realise that schools are often very tight with time. But having this 3 days was brilliant. I mean, if we could do it for longer, I would. And so here's two of the students. The one that's on the right here, she's the one that was saying, "Watch me fail," in that little video. And she did weaving and crocheting. Excuse me, sorry. And the student on the left, her mum's Papua New Guinean, and so it was also linking back to her matrilineal lineage, doing all of her weaving. And because, her dad's Aussie and European, and so she tends to mainly think of that side of her family, and she says she hadn't actually really engaged with her mum's side, and her mum, I don't think, really talked a huge amount about it, but this has been a great conduit for her to speak to her mum about all of that history. And the student on the right, hers was called "What If," and it's what if, instead of there had been basically the takeover by Europeans, what if we were melded together? So we worked with each other, the whole time. So I was mentioning this to Terry earlier, and he says, "Well, I don't think it will be a what if. I think it's a will be, and this part of this program is all part of that." So thanks. If we can go to the next slide. So that student that was on the left, this was her final piece, and the feathers that she also got were also relevant to Papua New Guinea. So her significant artists were Delvine and Lisi Carmichael, but also Zhang Zhaogang with his Bloodline series. So that's why there's the red thread of the bloodlines going through there. And there were also a data projector with video projected down onto the floor. Thank you. And the next, I think this is the last slide coming up. And so here's that final what if with multiple processes. So there's crocheting and weaving, etc. in this with both natural and man-made materials. And that is the end of my little presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And we did have a few questions come through there, which is great to have those questions coming through. I'm just going to go through a couple of them. Some I think the team are responding to just in terms of a bit of research while you were presenting. But look, thanks again, Andrew, for sharing all of that with us. I think the reason why we're getting questions through is because you're kind of inspiring people to think about how they might do something similar. And one of the questions there is from Kirsten in Dalby. Would you be happy to share this itinerary for the excursion? Would love to adapt it to the Dalby area.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. And I want to jump in on that one actually, because I think it kind of talks to, I guess, the point of why it's good to have dialogue and for people to share insights into what they've been doing with their opportunity to work in this kind of authentic arts learning space, as it's written in the curriculum, is that you've used the word there, Kirsten, adapt it to Dalby. And I think, yeah, it's important to really think about how you start with place first. So, you know, in the sense that if you do an authentic arts learning experience in Quandamooka or out in Carnarvon or in Dalby, you know, it's they're obviously going to be very different. And I think, you know, to answer that more fully, Andrew, I guess, what is it you think that, you know, how do you start? What's the first step? Is it to an adapter model, or is it probably difficult to answer now because you've done them a few times in your area? But let's say you were needing to do an authentic arts learning experience in a different location. What would the first steps be?
Okay, well, in fact, for us, as I've said, this is with Janelle in my ear and always loving the Chiligo idea. But Janelle also said, you know, make the students uncomfortable as possible. Now, we didn't do that. And this is also part of this, Terry. I had it was a brief conversation I had with you at least a year or maybe 2 years ago, because we were thinking, do we take our kids right away from here? Or do we engage right here where we live, where we come to school? Many of the kids, of course, go to Stradbroke on weekends. So it's a very familiar place to them. So it's not necessarily making them uncomfortable to go there. So we were thinking, do we take them west? Do we take them to a totally different environment that's not on the bay? You know, we're all like, our school here is only less than a kilometre from the water. Most afternoons we smell the salt air. So, our first step then was, do we start right here or do we take them somewhere else? That was number one thing. And if we are going to stay here, well then, how long are we going to spend here? You know, like, is this just going to be a day thing or a half an hour? Is this going to be, what's it going to be? And again, on the Janelle factor of taking them for multiple days is a great way of immersion. So we then went, we're going to go the multiple days, and then I already had the connection with the Carmichaels. And then we also got in contact with Delvine and got in contact with Matt. So in many ways, that initial stages was for connecting with quantum Muka artists is relatively easy, simply because they're so prominent. You know, they're already prominent at GOMA. So if we were going to go, say, to the Darling Downs or beyond, I'm not exactly sure how I would start with trying to connect with artists out there. Perhaps my next connection may well be with you, Terry, and asking, what artists do you know that are in those areas? That
this is the thing, isn't it? This is the thing, isn't it? And for us, and why I wanted to pause on the Dalby question was because the gallery from Dalby actually they came along to the Bunya Mountains workshop, and we did hold a consultation before we were running the workshops with the community there, and it didn't really tap into the fact that the Bunya Mountains was right next door. They're the closest regional town. And so, yeah, we do have those connections. And similarly, it was me talking to an artist who's got a lot to do with the gallery, who has connections in that area. And she directed me towards some elders who directed me towards a ranger. So it doesn't necessarily need to be an artist. It could be a ranger. It could be an elder. It could be an Aboriginal corporation or representative group. It's never easy. So you would, if you don't have those connections, you would need to start the conversations very early, before you even budget for something. And I think the key is, from the experiences that we've had, and I think what you've shared, Andrew, is that if you do make the time and plan for the time that's involved in having those conversations to find the right people, the authenticity of the experience is so much more palpable, and therefore the impact it has on student work is far greater.
We also had intended to have Delvine come to school here because we've just had a new building built, and it's part of it is there's a skylight in it, and we're wanting acrylic to be cut into it with that weaving pattern in it. And then, of course, the whole COVID thing hit, so it just became quite disjointed. But we wanted her to run workshops right from, with our preps right through. So we would hope that these experiences would also embed even further into what's happening throughout the school. So it's not just ends up being a thing for, you know, the end of year 11, we go on a 3-day thing, but there's a much deeper, again, sorry about the pun, but a much deeper thread goes through the whole thing, you know?
Yeah, that impact that, once you start a conversation, that's genuine and has really solid grounding, that all sorts of positives can come out of it. Andrew, I'm going to need to just quickly get you to respond to a few quick questions because we're getting tight on time.
Yep.
It was just about scaffolding the experience of sitting in the cemetery, being in the cemetery. Did you do any prep work for that? How did you frame it?
No, we didn't. No, we said we were going to go and spend time at the end of the trip in the cemetery, and there needed to be some points of silence in there, so they weren't to talk. In fact, we asked them to split up from each other and just walk between the grave sites. That was about it for the scaffolding. They were, of course, able to take photographs, etc. But from out of that, we had there were a couple of the students did things to do with lost histories of their own family. So, and you know, they weren't on dunnage or anything like that, but it was just triggered them for going, well, what is it for me personally with this? And in fact, I'll be part of history, and what will be left of me, in fact, when I'm gone. So will anybody really know much about me? So what do I know now of my grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents? So yeah, It was simply to spend time and some time in silence.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I'd love to riff off on that, but as I say, we're tight on time. And if you go into the Q&A yourself, you'll see that one teacher is actually asking for your permission to contact you directly to get some thoughts and advice as well. So, yeah, your time and your experience and sharing that with us is clearly of great value. So thank you, Andrew.
Pleasure. Thank you. Okay,
so we're now going to jump into as I said, a pre-recorded workshop that we weren't quite brave enough to try and stream this live, but wanting to break away from just the kind of, the head talking at you from Zoom and see if we can give you a more authentic maybe experience of a workshop. So we're going to try and upload that now and press play. This is from yesterday afternoon, Dale taking us through some of what we were talking to earlier. And,
well, as a part of my ongoing protocol here at QAGOMA, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this country, Turrbal and Yagara and Jagarapul countries, their communities and their elders and their families emerging. Looking at the Brisbane River now, and I offer my respect to the communities. Starting there, I'd love today to give a bit of a discussion around how to make some pigments and how to bring some art materials into someone's art practice that don't have to necessarily be framed in any kind of cultural framework necessarily. Domestic and non-art materials is really what I'm interested in today. In looking around me and looking around the spaces that we might be in, the classroom, or if we're even locked up at home, what's immediately around us, what are materials that are already there waiting, that might be already imbued with some content, pardon me, some content or some intention that you might bring over into an artwork. So if we click back to the work that was made in 2017 on commission from the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art, which was the wall composition in Reckitt's Blue. That work used a laundry powder. So it was a non-art material. It was a laundry powder that was used in domestic homes. And from that setting, I was able to see that as an art material, a potential art material, because it behaved and it acted in the ways that other sanctioned or identified pigments have been used over the centuries. Of course, I didn't invent that process. Of course, Indigenous peoples across the globe had been using Reckitt's Blue as a dry blue powdered pigment for quite some time, a couple of centuries. And of course, in central Queensland, Reckitt's Blue was already being used in the same way. But that for me is the foundation of looking at what materials are in our domestic setting that may not be coming in a jar or labelled as an art material that we can bring in and make some pigment from and then start to engage with. And for me, that's really about democratising. It's also, it frees us up from having to spend lots of money or to have access to stores, this kind of thing. But also it actually really clues in questions around what is in my world and what is already with me that might come into an artwork. So looking around me here now, there's a collection of different materials that I've brought in. Some of them I've brought in from my studio that have been used in the process of making paintings and making pigment, and some have been collected for today. So all of them tend to be fairly organic, and they tend to be materials that are readily available. One of the key things that is the binder for these is an acacia resin, an acacia that comes from, I believe, North Africa, gum arabic. Most people might be familiar with gum arabic. It's the binder that's used in watercolours, and it's been used since Renaissance time as a binder in holding earth pigments to make watercolours. So here is some of the raw crystal form gum arabic. Often it's purchased in liquid form. This for me is far better economically a way of using and engaging with gum arabic. The crystal forms are water soluble. They're very safe, and I understand that in multiple cultures that they actually used, gum arabic is used for food production. So it is safe. I've had it around my body a lot, and I believe it to be a really wonderful material that's now becoming more accessible. So gum arabic, as I say, is water soluble. Here is some gum arabic that we've added some almost boiling water to. I try to think of the materials compassionately, and I think extreme heat and extreme pressures and these kinds of things are potentially damaging the material, but also compassionately, good, strong, warm water feels better for me than boiling, proper boiling water on the gum arabic. So that's been enough to liquefy the gum arabic, just like putting a jube, a lolly into a glass of water, and it's now become slippery. And for me, I'll just come back to a bit of a caveat on this, is that some people might have a really clear, formal art world training in these materials, but I come at them with a strong sensibility to work with them as makes sense for me. So I actually kind of like gum arabic to be fairly slippery. I've spoken to others who are quite trained, and they talk about the ratios, the different quantities and ratios and these kinds of things. You can go there, that's great, but learning and playing with it, slippery is good enough for me. So that's probably there at that kind of coloration, what is that, maybe sort of almost olive oil colour, is perfect for me. So I'll decant that now to get that off there so that it doesn't become too heavy as a film. And then, so that is a perfect solution of gum arabic for me, the way that I use it. And then those gum arabic crystals or nodules are still viable. So if I was to top that up again, you'd get an equal amount again. So it goes a really long way. And already that is probably technically slightly heavy saturation by some people's standards. So that could be split and split and split. So a few crystals really goes a long way in the gum arabic. So that's the basis of what I've been doing for a little while, is looking at tree saps and botanical resins that have historically been used and can be brought in as a binder for pigment. And gum arabic for me is the best because it's accessible and it goes so well. Might I just say that, like anything organic in liquid, it will go sour. It'll kind of go a bit vinegary or a bit cheesy after a couple of weeks. So beware of that and open them outdoors if you've had them going for a couple of weeks. So that's the foundation, that's the gum arabic. And then from there, I've brought in a range of different raw materials, which artists across cultures, across formal or informal training, inside and outside of the museum, artists have been using these similar kinds of materials in the same sensibility for tens of thousands of years. So here is some rust, so it's some ferrous steel surface rust off some plate that's near my studio. So that can be ground up, and I'll do that in a few moments. But that is essentially just iron oxide, the oxidization of steel. I have here a few rocks. This one is, I believe, part of an old red brick from around the studio as well, which I picked up a few years ago. I don't believe it's anything in that kind of mudstony. I reckon it's probably more been baked. I feel like it's a bit more of like a red brick, the corner of a red brick, or an inclusion or an imperfection out of a very old brick. And I've used that to draw onto concrete and to grind up and make pigment. So my preference is to be aware of the ways that cultural uses of what my family and other cultures might include as ochre, that they're significantly different to what I'm looking to talk about today. There are specific and even sacred reasons why ochre is designated and used and important that way. But certainly bricks and ferrous steel can be used and can be engaged with very safely and very lovingly in the same way. So that's a bit of a red brick. This is a sawn-off old ferrous steel bolt, and if I wanted to today, I could use a palette knife, or even again, coming back even more basic, just an old spoon that you won't use again. I could pull some of the oxidization off that bolt, capture it in a good way, do that very sensitively and carefully, capture that oxidization, mix it with the binder. It might take a little bit more grinding down to consolidate it more as a paint, so that you don't just have sort of granules sitting in a liquid, but there's pigment there as well, which will get you in those rusty browns as well. For me, that bolt could be used over and over again if there was a small, maybe even a weak solution of an acid, vinegar, household vinegar. Dropping that into the vinegar overnight or every couple of days, you'll have a ready supply of the different oxidizations between, you know, bright yellows through to browns, just from a bolt that you've picked up even on the side of the road. And so that, yeah, for me, that's an ongoing source. But also, I'll just show before I start grinding, other really accessible forms of pigment might be the residue from a good black coffee. So, might I say, during COVID times, keeper cups haven't been so welcome. So I've got a couple of dried out long black cups here. And what I'll do soon is use some of the gum arabic and transfer that pigment. And again, that will carry as something you can make marks with and tell a story. For me, already there's a story in that. Given that keeper cups during COVID time haven't been so welcome, I've been, in some cases, you know, not much choice other than to take a paper cup, which I prefer not to. Then already I can use that to tell a story of this time. The fact that I'm using a paper cup as a disposable resource I prefer not to, already that's loaded with intent. Already that's loaded with something that I can draw on to tell part of a story if I wanted to sit and make something. So what might be thrown away already has a bit of a story there, particularly if you have a bit of a need for coffee. That can be part of the process of drawing out that pigment, and it is fairly stable. We've all seen tea bags and coffee used in staining and patinaing in craft and art processes for a really long time. So that is cheap and readily loaded with story if you want to go there. There's another, but also I have made use of the different sort of batches that I've made up, and I try to keep them nearby. Because the gum arabic is water soluble, you can come back time and time again like watercolour and pick that up and keep using it. So even though technically that's been used up as a batch, there's still enough pigment in there to tell quite a story on a sheet of watercolour paper. So again, coming back to thinking about resources, again thinking about what's around us and making the most of what's around us, I'd suggest that there's enough in there for a couple of people to make a painting in terms of pigment, and reconstituting that with the gum arabic. So maybe that is now time to, I'll start with the coffee, use some of the liquid gum arabic solution and just loosen it up. It happens very readily, and already there's pigment transferring. This is all knowledge that we all already have. It's just some of the questions as an artist is, what do we already have around us that we can draw upon to start to build the cultures and the visual cultures that we want, right? So we already know coffee transfers like this, and very readily it will continue to spread and make marks. And I'll show it up for the camera in a moment. But you can go between really heavy densities, thinning it back out with a little more gum arabic, and start to do washes. So what happens if a dialogue is established with an artwork? Asking questions. It could be something in the trade of coffee, or it could be something in your inability to access cafes if you're in somewhere that's locked down, this kind of thing. So instantly we have content and intention of the artist imbued in the materials as soon as you pick them up. So they will dry down, and also because again the gum arabic is water soluble, you can come back and push them and move them around. Again, it's really very similar to watercolour, so many people might be highly trained in watercolour. It's just another development upon there for me. So that's black coffee. So having looked at a leftover coffee cup and made marks using the gum arabic as the binder, that is the initial points to making a work. You've already begun the process, the performative element is there, it's already loaded up. So then from here, the marks can be developed out, and Terry made a great point a moment ago about they can be scanned, they can be used, digitized, they can be drawn out of the fact that they're a mark, but at least the process has begun in making gestures and taking form. So from the very grassroots and basic democratic kind of processes, I'll swing back now to where some of my other information has come from around how to draw pigments from paints from pigments that are around us. Part of the Queensland Art Gallery's process is the conservation team, and the team here have been able to give access to some of the historical pigments that were highly precious and highly prized and seriously worked, and great intention put behind them in Renaissance painting. So lapis lazuli, the ceiling of the Scrivenia Chapel. And lapis lazuli at different times was more valuable than gold as a commodity because of its the way it was loaded with religious and other value. So from a stone, the process of making lapis lazuli, there's other stuff online, but it's very involved in going through stages to draw out the pure pigment. So that's actually more involved than just grinding down the stone. There's actually removal of impurities to get to the lapis lazuli powder that I understand. But also similarly is azurite, which is in the copper family. There's some of the raw material that the QAGOMA team have made available for demonstration. Lazurite is a raw material, similarly made into a powder, and then with different binders, historically oil paint and these kind of things as binders to draw them into painting. That's where it becomes really fascinating in which binder for what material, which process of extrapolating the pigment for what material. Some materials don't like metals, so they have to be ceramic or stone or glass, these kind of ones. So that's another degree again, and there's wonderful learning that can be done there. But maybe that's in a different place to where we're interested today. But certainly some of the basic toolkit from that process from hundreds of years ago is the glass muller or muller, a glass plate, which for me is a leftover from one of my works. It is hardened, toughened glass. It could just be a louver. I also do use just a louver that I pulled out of nearby the studio, a glass louver. But for this purpose, toughened glass is the go. Glass on glass means that there won't be any transfer of a pigment to alter the colour of what you're looking to produce. The clear glass will only give a kind of luminosity, which was a deliberate process in other paint making. So from there, let's try some of... You can go out and purchase all sorts of palette knives, which are beautiful. Teaspoons and spoons, dessert spoons are really actually more than adequate. So this is a bit of that surface oxidization from the steel plate. It could be taken off an old bomb of a car down the paddock, scraped it from underneath, anywhere, this kind of stuff. Old gutters particularly kind of flake up and go rusty like this. So a bit of that surface oxidization. Let's have a go at... Typically you could use a art designated mortar and pestle. I've got a few of these that I have only for different purposes. Some are for purposes where I would deliberately put them into my body and they only ever have safe materials that way. Others I know that whatever I grind in there never goes near food or into my mouth. So an artwork designated mortar and pestle, or using the glass muller, you can pull that bulk material down to a finer powder, and with some time and with some what I'd suggest probably is that each material and each situation is probably going to ask for a bit of your own experience and intuition and learning from that material. We can give formulas and give good ways to set about it, but each time you'll probably need to just work with that material to see what it wants to do on that particular day to get you the best result. So making that lovely fine powder, reducing that down to the finest powder possible, and I'll sort of shortcut it a little bit. So you find that rust oxidization comes down to a superfine powder really, really easily. It probably won't need to be strained, depending on what you want to do. I have little tea strainers, are a little coarse, but you can use Chuck's cloth as a really great strainer because it's got enough holes in there that it'll still let the superfine dust to pass, and then you can keep grinding. But you can find sieves around the house. You don't need to specifically go out and buy a strainer or a sieve. Chuck's cloth works really well for me. Let's say that that's been prepared to the way that I want it. I transfer this out. And it's often such small batches that some good steady hands and no wind is really helpful. So then is some, different graded iron oxide there. My preference would be to get it more uniform. Here is some of the liquid gum arabic. Of course, water and ferrous metals will continue to shift the colour of it, which is, oils might be a different story. But knowing that from the outset, here's some gum arabic into the powder. And another brush. So very quickly we've ended up with a little bit grainy, but a good pigment which will still continue to transfer. So alongside the coffee, that's where it starts to settle down. So it'll probably go blacker actually, now we start to see that. Blacker areas as it oxidizes further. And as we shift and pull that out, it can be graded and brought down to a nice workable surface. So again, that is just simple rust. Obviously be aware of dust in all of these processes. Try to be considerate of the dust that you're kicking up. If you choose, I often choose for myself to wear a dust mask, a suitable dust mask. So that's the iron oxide. So that has achieved quite a workable paint. Often they're more of a glaze or a watercolour than like a film build paint like an acrylic. So thinking that from the outset, you're kind of more staining or putting the essence of the raw material into the paper. It would take a little bit of finessing to build that up because it is water soluble. So using probably really lovely soft like wash brushes, you could build that up to a solid block. I'd suggest that just slowly letting it dry completely in between and then quick runs over with a glaze, you'd be able to build that up. And really what it does end up doing is like a Japanese or a Chinese lacquer. For real, it gets beautiful lacquered finish as you build that up. But that requires a bit of finessing and a little bit of time and patience. All from rusted metal. Let's put that aside. So there's a little bit of kind of purpley red colours as that dries down, and I'll show again in a minute. Here's that red, what I believe is the inclusion from a red brick or a bit of a pebble. My glass plate has been used enough that it's got a bit of a keying surface on there. It's not completely smooth glass. So this is a slightly different process. I'd prefer to put some liquid gum arabic down first and grind this into that as a process. So using the found brick, grinding that back into the gum arabic is already producing quite a beautiful gingery coloured pigment. What happens if you've got a terracotta pot and that's been busted up, and you use the chips of a terracotta pot. Yeah, I reckon there would be lots of different materials around the place that can be used. So straight up, that's created quite a vivid gingery coloured pigment. You can continue to grind that in to get a very strong one, but that looks good to me. And brush, where'd it go? So I'll just pull a bit more of that iron oxide back out of the bristles for demonstration. But here is the straight up, what I say is a brick. Ends up being, fairly gingery red. And depending on the thickness of your solution of gum arabic, you can wash it right out like a real wash in watercolour, or you can, as I say, start to glaze it up and build it up. That's probably about 6 cents worth of material to get you on your way. Again, what happens if it is a terracotta pot? One of the students have a grandparent and they have a favourite terracotta pot. It breaks. The terracotta pot could be used to grind up and tell the story of that process, or to link back to a family story. So that's the way that I would consider the materials. I'll leave that one there. So also showing and reminding that because the gum arabic is water soluble, I deliberately leave leftovers on my glass palette because they can be picked up again at any point. So that's some of the dried material from another time, and quite readily it picks up again and goes as a transferable pigment. So then I've arrived at, when I wanted a specific process, purchasing artist materials, and as a pre-ground pigment, which is now readily available, really prominent. That's a very high saturated version of pre-ground artist dry pigment and gum arabic, and that's a super high density watercolor that I can reuse and reuse and reuse. So it might look crusty and dried out, but actually that's perfectly usable for quite some time. So the initial outlay there was really just for the dry pigment, and now I've got an ongoing supply of this high intensity red. And as another option during kind of lockdown times or around the classroom, there's also a source of pigment in pencils. And I have a theory, and let's try this out live, is that stripping back or even opening up the pencil, drawing out the pigment, grinding it up similarly, and applying it to the gum arabic, you can then end up with a similar kind of watercolour wash, I'd suggest. So, but for today, we'll just kind of grind a bit off. And this would be, of course, if there were damaged or busted up pencils, ones that are going to get thrown out, or old, sort of water soaked or whatever. So let's start there. There's a bit of pigment there. If I had that in a nice surface, I might grind that into a different way and then add the gum arabic. But let's just try this, for example, and see if it will begin to consolidate. So again, does someone inherit a pencil, or is there a pencil that's travelled in a backpack for years and years? Or there's a story of an Aboriginal elder who I read his story years ago, and he taught himself to read by using TAB bedding pencils. So TAB pencils also have another imbued history in that context. What is, if you have a crusty old pencil, what is its story that it can lend to the artwork? And there we have a usable transferable pigment. It's a bit thinner. What is it? It's it's a bit thinner and a bit lighter. but it'll probably dry down pretty vivid, I'll suggest. So that's pencils. And then in a really similar way, there's a bit of a stub of a dry pastel, not an oil pastel. I don't believe it's a Conte. I'm going to say it would be one of the old dusty dry pastels. And I reckon that's going to do a similar one. Or if there's any charcoal out of a fire or little stubs of charcoal sticks, little leftover stubs that you can hardly pick up as well, they can be ground and even maybe set into little watercolour capsules. I've used in the past ice cube trays. I found that one a bit tricky to how to get them out, but if you have sweet chili sauce containers from takeaway, perfect. Leftover stubs from Contes or pencils or whatever, grind them up, set them in gum arabic. There's a ready supply of a watercolour or other pigment that you can use into the future. There's all sorts of options being outlaid around making pigment, but swinging back then to, say, Renaissance painting and how to look around the place for other sources of pigment. Lamp black in the bottle or tube historically has come from the inside of the glass kerosene lamp or the lamp. So that is the black soot that has been captured and refined and processed to make lamp black, I understand. So then if that's one way it happens, where else does that process occur? I drove in from Western Queensland yesterday and I'd been considering what is the dust that's on the vehicle. I did clean the windscreen, but on the windscreen wipers, what dust or pigment is sitting there waiting? Around tyres, around hubs. Obviously grease is not going to be compatible with water-soluble gum arabic, but if lamp black comes from the capturing of that soot, where else can you find free, readily available sources of small amounts of pigment? And I'd say, yeah, things like that. Certainly, I see them around a lot. Copper and galvanised pipes go blue and green, gorgeous blues and greens. The stability of those colours is in question for me, but as they oxidise, they chunk up and they give lumps of different kind of azure coloured, because it really is copper, azurite sort of coloured pigment. There would be a bit of play involved in understanding the stability of that and how to work with that, but there's a free and natural source and around pipes and other things. So then, yeah, what's on the exterior of a car that's nice and safe? The dust on the tyres or the dust on the windscreen, particularly if you've taken a journey, and where has that dust come from? So then perhaps there might not be so much time to get into making a composition, but I have a friend and a colleague who, during the QAGOMA's process out at the Carnarvons last year, Vicky Saunders actually made for me gifted me a watercolour she made from the pigment there. So it had pigment and water and gum arabic made essentially to this kind of scenario. And then literally using the water of that location, a portrait was made, or a landscape, I call it a portrait of a place, a portrait of who the place is. A portrait was made of that location on a nice watercolour paper and gifted. And so for me, I still have that as a memory of actually the place that was being depicted in the composition. So skillful, beautiful, skillful washy watercolour to create the landforms, but knowing actually its means of production imbues it with more care for me, or more interest for me as an artist, the way I tend to work, because it is rooted in all those different parts of the story. Yeah, and shifting from there, then what is the substrate you paint onto? So that was a watercolour postcard, and again, a postcard is typically talking about a place or a time that is not now or nearby. But what are the other materials that might be available? Things like paper bark does take pigment, but you tend to have to build that up on the surface of paper bark, I understand. If that's available, if it's readily on the ground, this kind of thing, without intervening in the life cycle of a tree or a series of trees. If that's readily available, that paper bark might be one, other different barks, offcuts of timber, and cardboard is something actually I've got an interest in. QAGOMA in one of the APTs had a series of artworks that I believe came from the Pacific on cardboard boxes, and that's always stuck with me, that the leftover cardboard box had been used as the substrate. So what happens if gum arabic is built in, layered and layered and layered, and you create a good, nice, strong substrate from a cardboard banana box or similar? So again, there might be some of the artist's intent in the material that you're working onto, the substrate you're working onto, and perhaps we might leave it there. One last pointer is that should, as it might be evident by now, should you be needing to move on and not come back for a short period of time, that will dry out the kind of gummy, sort of jelly set gum arabic. That'll dry out, and you can add water to that at a later state and use it. This one will go off, so make choices in the amount of gum arabic that you produce at the time that you want them, so that you don't have large amounts that are going to waste and sort of turning and becoming vinegar or cheesy, this kind of stuff. So I try to also be really considerate of the resources that I'm using, and perhaps I'll leave it there.
So, an incredible video, and we understand that there might have been variances depending on where you're based and how strong the network is, and know that people are coming in from regional locations. So, we've noted that we'll make sure that the videos are uploaded as part of the Artist Exchange resource, and great to see some acknowledgements and thank yous to Dale coming through, because as I said at the top of the program that today, that it's been so wonderful to work with Dale and how generous he's been and coming in yesterday and working with us to do that video. We used technology that we've not used before, so that was the first, and very generous knowledge that Dale shared with us, as well as his time. So echoing the thanks that are coming through there from me to you, Dale, and from the learning team as well. There were a few questions, but mindful that we're now up time-wise, so we've just been managing a few of those questions through the chats and the Q&A, but we really want to wrap up by reminding, placing the emphasis on the fact that this Artist Exchange resource for Carnarvon is the first one to go live, and it's up online now. And so there is a workshop page and PDF available within that explains the process, and you can see Dale's hands working the material from when we ran the workshop in Carnarvon. So we would actually love to see if any of you who've joined us today could give it a go yourself, with students if you like, or family, whoever, and send us back what you've done and how you found it going. And if you would like to work with the gum arabic, there's just an image there. You can get it in the crystal form, but also powder and liquid. And as Dale says in the video, it's probably best to work with the crystals in terms of the value you get out of it and the qualities that brings. So yeah, please do give it a go and send it through to us. We'd love to send what you do with your students with Dale and include that potentially in the Artist Exchange resource as well. We're going to trial a new way of showcasing what teachers and students do with our resources within the online resources that we're all starting to get better at developing now due to the COVID situation. So yeah, just an emphasis that there's the link to the resource, and we will keep pushing through to create more of these with Gari and Vanya Mountains Resources and Development. I wanted to give a moment just to see if Dale, if you wanted to jump in, and you've been holding tight while the version of yourself from yesterday presents the workshop. So if we wanted to bring it more into the present and give you an opportunity to maybe even sign off if you're comfortable.
Okay, sure. I've been just, thanks Terry, and again I'd like to give a serious thumbs up to Terry, to Emily, to Rebecca, and to Debbie for the work that they do here. I've really enjoyed this, but also scrolling through, it's really superb for me to see so many far out, like regional and other teachers signed in. It's a priority for me to see that everyone has an ability to share in what happens here at QAGOMA in these beautiful buildings, and that's superb. All the local, regional, within driving distance, and out there at Winton and Dalby and all the other places I spotted. So, thanks so much.
Thanks, Dale. Just one last. Just noting that we will get questions and responses back to you guys if we didn't quite get to it. But yeah, it's been a full session, and thanks again, everyone, for tuning in on your Saturday morning. Thank you, Dale, and thank you, Andrew. Have a good day, everyone. Take care.